Let me start by saying that as I've been coming into the knowledge of so much history I didn't know or simply didn't pay attention to as I was growing up, I gotta say it comes with a myriad of emotions. As the Honorable Marcus Garvey said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origins, culture, is like a tree without roots. As I learn more, I feel the roots of my true identity emerging and growing. With that being said, in the year 1767, a child was born into a life sentence of enslavement on the island of St. Thomas, then a colony of Denmark, but now the U.S. Virgin Islands. That child would grow up to become a person of historical significance. 14 years later, in 1781, that same child would grab the attention of Captain Joseph Vesey, a slave trader, who had that year took on board his slave ship a cargo of 390 enslaved Africans. The captain made this 14-year-old boy either a cabin boy or, as some would say, their little black pet. They gave him new clothes and named him Telemaque. He was then sold to a farmer in Saint Dominique, a French colony from 1659 to 1804 on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, the island that now hosts two countries, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. On Vesey's next trip to Cape Francis, Vesey was told that Telemaque would have to be returned to him because the boy had epileptic fits and was deemed defective merchandise. Being a clever young African, I believe he faked those epileptic fits to get from under the thumb of this new oppressor and back to, shall we say, the lesser of two evils. Telemaque never again showed any signs of epilepsy as he traveled the world with Captain Vesey, educating himself and learning to speak various languages until eventually Captain Vesey, along with his personal servant Telemaque, settled in Charleston, South Carolina in 1783. As the years progressed, Telemaque became a skilled carpenter. His skill as a carpenter would one day afford him the opportunity to participate in the Charleston East Bay Street Lottery. After the colonies won the war against the British, the new states leaned heavily on lotteries to raise revenue because they were not eager to tax a people who had just rebelled against taxation by the British. Lotteries became the alternative for a while. But on Friday, November 8th, 1799, the city treasurer drew the lottery number 1884 from the Wheel of Fortune for a grand prize of $1,500. This number, we now know, had been purchased by the enslaved man Telemaque. Apparently, during that time in Charleston's early development, it was a familiar arrangement in urban Charleston to allow enslaved workers to make a little money from time to time. Telemaque probably raised the money using his carpentry skills to purchase the $6 ticket. Even so, I can't help but think that giving $1,500 to a slave probably met with some reluctance and controversy we may never know about. But whatever the case, the brother got paid. Telemaque immediately negotiated with his owners for his freedom in the amount of $600, and by December, Telemaque was a free man. After securing his freedom, Telemaque changed his name to Denmark Vesey. Unfortunately, Denmark was unable to secure the freedom of his wife and children, even though he became a successful carpenter. Slave owners were not under any obligation to free slaves, even if they were offered compensation. I imagine that didn't sit well with Brother Denmark. With his freedom and the thriving carpentry business, Denmark Vesey became a leading figure in Charleston's black community. In 1818, he was one of the co-founders of the Hampstead Church, which broke away from the Methodist Episcopal Church, a white church. This was part of a larger movement of blacks forming their own churches in the South to have the freedom to worship as they saw fit. This church would become Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's the church that on that fateful day in June, the 17th of June, 2015, Dylann Roof, a deranged 21-year-old hate-filled white supremacist, massacred 9 church members. But back to the story. Veazey quickly became a leader at the church. He preached to small groups at his home, teaching them spiritual lessons. The white community, however, in Charleston was alarmed by the presence of what they called the African church and continuously disrupted services and tried to undermine it. This angered Veazey, and his preaching became more radical and militant. He told his people they were the new Israelites, the people chosen by God to be freed from enslavement and empowered to punish their masters. Soon, Veazey was using the church gatherings to plot and plan a slave revolt. It's not hard to imagine the anger he must have felt, seeing his people being treated as chattel and realizing that his own freedom stood on dangerous ground. Though numbers vary, the consensus is that during that time it's believed that Charleston was 70% black and 30% white. That's an interesting statistic that raises questions in my mind that would be interesting conversation for another time. But for several years, Denmark was constantly and diligently engaged in highlighting the injustices committed against the African population in and around the state of South Carolina. He familiarized himself with all those parts of the scriptures to prove that slavery was contrary to the laws of God and that slaves were bound to attempt their emancipation, however shocking and bloody consequences be. He not only claimed that such efforts would be pleasing to the Almighty, but that their success was predicted in the scriptures. Denmark Veazey's inspiration to free the slaves in Charleston was the successful slave uprising of 1791, which resulted in Saint Dominique becoming the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. He preached to the people, urging them to break free from slavery. He gathered many followers. He planned the uprising with the help of Ned and Rolla Bennett. Ned Bennett was the trusted slave of South Carolina Governor Thomas Bennett. Rolla Bennett routinely took charge of the governor's household during his absences. Peter Poyas, a ship's carpenter, and Gullah Jack, an African spiritualist and abolitionist, were also Denmark's comrades in the rebellion. He managed to secure the support of both slaves and free blacks who agreed to support the cause and be part of the rebellion. The plan was to be executed at midnight on Bastille Day, July 14, 1822, with enslaved blacks numbering around 9,000. They planned to kill the slave owners, free the slaves, and set sail to Haiti. Almost every plantation in Charleston had joined Veazey's rebellion. They organized the revolt in separate cells under individual leaders. That way, if anyone betrayed the plot, they would only betray their own plantation cell and not the others. The plan was that the rebels would station themselves outside of the homes of the slave owners, and late at night, a group of them would start a fire. When the slave owners came out of their homes, the slaves would kill them with axes, guns, or whatever weapons they could find. They would then, just like Nat Turner did, go into the homes and kill all its occupants. However, in June of 1822, just before the uprising was to take place, the plan was leaked by 2 slaves loyal to their masters. The revolt was betrayed by a slave named George Wilson, who knew the entire plot. Like Veazey, George Wilson was a class leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but he followed the Christian doctrine of loving one's neighbor and was devoted to his master. Immediately, the city leaders alerted the authorities, and Veazey and 46 other blacks and 4 whites were indicted in the plot. After a lengthy trial, 43 slaves were deported and 35 were hanged. Veazey was condemned to death, along with Rolla, Horace, and 3 other slaves on the morning of July 2nd, 1822. Vesey was hung. As an aftermath, life became more difficult for the slaves. The state passed new restrictions on movements of black slaves and prevented the entry of free blacks in the city. Denmark Vesey was remembered well into the First Civil War. "Remember Denmark Vesey of Charleston" became the war cry of the 1st Black Regiment of the Civil War. However, the details of the uprising were greatly underplayed by the slave owners and the authorities. Denmark Vesey, the slave rebellion leader, a symbol of the resistance of the enslaved, was gradually pushed into oblivion.